All right, I'm going to have a very brief bio, and then we'll jump right into it. Dr. Tam is an associate professor of East Asian history here at Trinity, and she completed her PhD in modern Chinese history at Stanford and received her BA in history and Asian studies. She serves as the co-director of Women and Gender Studies and a core faculty member of the East Asian Studies here. She had her first book, Dialect and Nationalism in China between 1860 and 1960, has won several awards. And she's also appeared on BBC and written several articles in Foreign Affairs, The Nation, and many others. So thank you, Dr. Tam, for being here. Dr. Yu Sun received her PhD in management sciences. She's also got an MA in mathematical statistics. She decided to get another PhD in applied mathematics, so she's got that. And she joined the Department of Leadership Studies at Our Lady of the Lake University. And I didn't know this, but Our Lady of the Lake also has an office in Houston. So that's why she's zooming in. I told her you could just drive. She's like, "Where's the event going to be held?" I'm like, "Trinity, just take Culebra to I-10." And she's like, "No, I'm in Houston." I'm like, "Oh, okay, all right." So thank you, Dr. Soon. And she has also published 2 book chapters in business management and leadership, and she does research in areas of leadership studies, emotional intelligence, operation management, business analysis. She's an active member of the Asian Chamber of Commerce in Houston. All right, let's get right into it. And a lot has changed since Ambassador Huntsman's discussion of what you just heard. Today, actually, former President Jiang Zemin passed away, who was the president of China right after Tiananmen Square. Maybe we start right there and talk a little bit about his passing, his impact, and if it has any potential impact on the protesters. If you want to begin, Dr. Tam.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for being here. So Jiang Zemin was chosen. He was secretary in Shanghai during the Tiananmen Square protest, and then became the leader of China right after Deng Xiaoping in the 1990s. And his legacy, I think, is really it's complicated. Sometimes he is sort of known as kind of a lovable man. Sometimes he gets a little bit of a buffoonish reputation, but he oversaw a really important period in Chinese history, in the sense of sort of China's meteoric economic rise in the 1990s, and other sorts of challenges. As sort of to tie it into the protests, for those who are not sort of watching the news really actively, today is the 30th, so 6 days ago, there was a fire in an apartment building in Urumqi, China, which is in the western province of Xinjiang. And at least 10 people died in this fire. And there seems to be a fair amount of evidence, so it's difficult to get a lot of evidence out of that region, that in part those deaths were caused by COVID lockdowns, right? That it delayed emergency response, and that people were locked in their apartments because of quarantine laws, right? And so we don't actually know the entire death toll. They vary, but at least 10 people died. And that sparked a series of protests over the weekend that began throughout several cities. Several protesters gathered on Urumqi Road in Shanghai, and several other areas. So these protests are rather unprecedented. I think, at least in the last decade, if not in the last 30 years. In part, they are unprecedented because there are lots of protests in China. They happen a lot, but usually they are very local, and they're about very local issues. For them to be shared across cities across China is rather uncommon, very uncommon. The other reason they're rather unprecedented is that while a lot of the focus of the protesters is on the COVID lockdowns, that's kind of the primary focus, is no more lockdowns, no more testing. But you also get a lot of you're getting chants and people recording things of like "down with Xi Jinping" and "down with the Communist Party," and that is a really rare thing to hear people publicly say, right? So how does the death of Jiang Zemin fit in? It happened today, so I don't think we know yet. He would be a sort of strange protest icon, I think. There are some sort of people who are theorizing that in 1989, during the Tiananmen Square protests, those were sparked by the death of a party leader, Hu Yaobang. However, Hu Yaobang was already sort of upheld as a pretty significant and important reformer to youth in the 1980s. I don't think we can say that about Jiang Zemin in the same way. That said, we are seeing increased police presence elsewhere. So even if protesters don't see him as sort of like a symbol, I think the Communist Party fears that he might be, right? So I think they're on high alert. That would, that's sort of my a hot take at this point. I don't know if Dr. Sun, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely what's going on, and it has been a topic across the U.S. more than in China. And then you probably in certain area of China, you probably didn't heard of this. But I just want to provide a little bit context and background about this protest and why, I mean, what we heard. I grew up in there, and then I still have family friends that, you know, have connections and talk very often in there, so we can get kind of insight about what's happening. I think just a context that when we talk about lockdown or quarantine, that is different than what we, you know, common sense we in the US would think about it. And then considering the living condition in China, that especially large city, we live in apartment. When we see apartment, it's not like 2 floor and then just like 2 doors. And we would see people in apartment, it would be like buildings with 50 stores or 30 stories. And so when they see lockdown, it means that the whole building was locked down with the whole, like, everyone. And then I think the frustration is come from the people that the uncertainty, and then you end up with that you go visit your friend and then you come back to your home and you won't be able to get in for maybe 10 days. And then you would go out for a business trip and then you stuck within another city because the whole city would have like lockdown. When they say lockdown, meaning that you cannot get out of the state. You have to stay there for maybe 10 days, 14 days. And then I have a example that my cousin actually went last week, I mean 2 weeks ago. And then by the time she get off of the building, and she used a different door that day, and then she got out of the building, but then the next minute she received a text message from her colleague saying that that building was locked down, and then her colleagues was locked in that building for 7 days. So it's like the uncertainty, you never know. You went out for a supermarket, you come back and you find that you won't be able to get into your home. Wow. So I think that restriction is at the level that beyond the imagination, or, you know, what happens here, that it's mandatory lockdown. When we see lockdown, they would nail the wood at the front door of the whole, like the building, and then you would have people like a guard outside the building to just, you know, tell you cannot go out. And another thing is that they use a QR code that you probably don't see it very often here. Use it like a pass everywhere. So you have to scan your barcode. The barcode will have red, yellow, green, and your barcode has to be green for you to be able to on the bus. So you get on the bus, you scan your QR code, and it has to be green for you to be on there. And then if you go to supermarket, you have to scan. And then you go to, of course, hospital, you have to scan your QR code. Only when it's green, you're able to access. So if it's yellow, that means you're close or you have contact with someone is identified as positive. And then red, of course, that means, you know, you're either like positive or like you were like very close with that contact. So with that context, you can imagine we have been in China, people have been going through this situation for 3 years. And it's still happening like today. So I think that's the frustration that people are facing, that they really just want this zero COVID policy would be a little bit loose. They just need to get back to their normal work and life. And then they want and then a lot of things, other things related would be like people lost job because this quarantine or lockdown, that you know, a company, you would go to there and the next day, you know, one people get positive, but the whole company will get locked down. And I have another friend that just had in Guangzhou, just has a another lockdown for 20 days, that the company is just out of business, and then people, of course, and then you will lose job, and then the next thing you know, you still have to pay for your mortgage and everything. So it just, I think it's for normal people, it's just their normal life. They just, that's what they're only, I mean, most of the intention about this protest.
Thank you for that. Let's open up that protest wound a little bit more and kind of dig in. And I know Colonel Lamborn had a question in line with what my question was, which is looking at the political implications of what both of you said on President Xi Jinping. What is the outlook for, you know, is there an existential threat to the party, to his presidency? What does that look like to you? You want to take that, Dr. Sun?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, in China, from what we heard, you know, in general from media, and then to all the like TV and then the radio that you heard, is that we are very firm in terms of the policy, in terms of relationship with the U.S. And then I think in general for population in China, that they all like can agree with this policy to be firm, and then to be tough with what's going on, especially during the COVID-19, and then the anti-globalization, and then when the supply chain changed, and then also the that growing of China becoming more stronger and stronger, and then they are more confident in terms of takeover, and then want to be do not want to be always like number two, right? And then of course then the U.S. has been the only super country since you know, since for forever. So of course I think from each side they are more firm, and then do not want to compromise with each other in terms of more collaboration. So I would anticipate or say that in the past 10 to 20 years, it would be the best like a close relationship between the two countries. But moving forward, we would see more about deep independence and also competitive independence. I would see this like a continuous matrix, that instead of seeing either or, but rather than, you know, more lean to or more towards to a competitive relationship.
So in thinking about whether or not this is an existential threat, I want to look sort of like both backwards and forwards. So I agree entirely with everything Dr. Sun said in how much the nature of the zero COVID, or I guess it's dynamic zero now, the nature of this COVID policy creates just an enormous amount. Like, I think we talk a lot in the United States about how the uncertainty of COVID just created this weight that we all carry around, and we're all still, I think, grieving a little bit. And I don't think we've faced that level of uncertainty that people in China have faced, where you're locked in your home and you don't know if you're going to be out tomorrow or in 2 weeks or in 2 months, in the case of people in Shanghai. Thinking more broadly, however, I also think that this was sort of one more thing to add on to what I think is sort of a slower process of just taking bits and pieces of joy out of people's lives. And I actually wrote down a post on Chinese social media that I think really captured this really beautifully. And so this was really popular until it got taken down. But Chinese people are getting by with books published 20 years ago, music released a decade ago, travel photos from 5 years ago, income earned last year, frozen dumplings from a lockdown 3 months ago, COVID tests from yesterday, and a freshly baked Soviet joke from today. So I think there's a growing sense in which just how much more can you sort of squeeze joy out of people's lives, whether it's like Shanghai Disneyland was open for 4 days and then it closed down again, and things like that. So in thinking about these protests, the immediate spark, I think, was that COVID lockdowns, which I do want to stress have been hurting people that are not urban educated people for a long time. There were major labor protests at a Foxconn factory in the last couple of weeks. People were jumping the fence to try and escape what is essentially like what's called a closed loop system, which is basically keeping people there and not letting them leave so there's no infections and they can keep producing, right? And so, but now I think it's starting to hit people with a little bit more visibility and people with a little bit more power. So these are real problems. These are real threats, right? That said, I'm always wary to talk about what might be considered an existential threat to China. I'm a historian. We don't like predicting the future. We're very wary about it. But I think the way I think about it is that what is an existential threat never is obvious in the moment. These things are always surprising. I think about 1989. We all thought that 1989 was an existential threat to the CCP, and we all thought that Taiwan would never become democratic, and it turns out that was flipped, right? The other reason that I think we should be wary of thinking about existential threats is that I think the question poses a dichotomy, that there's either like nothing happens and it fizzles out, or the CCP gets deposed. And there are a million ways that a social movement can affect a country. And when we're focused on one of those two options, I think we miss all of the ways that we might see changes. I spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about the 2019 protests. And I don't think anybody could have anticipated the changes that caused. And I think we still don't know what those caused. And so that's the way I think about it, which I feel like is a Weasley answer, and I'm sorry, but yeah.
Thank you. We heard Ambassador Huntsman talk about how competition is a good thing. And what is, in your minds, what does cooperation and competition look like? And I remember reading recently about how China is purchasing lands all over the U.S. I think it's up 200,000 acres in the Dakotas, some parts of Dakotas. But what does cooperation and competition look like between the two? If you want to start, Dr. Tam.
Yeah, I can start, and then I think we can have Dr. Sin. Oh goodness. So what I really liked about what Ambassador Huntsman says is that I think that competition is valuable for American interests when we know what our interests are, and that competition for competition's sake is really not helpful, right? And so I don't think that the current administration has a clear sense of what those interests are. There is more continuity from the Trump administration, the Biden administration, in terms of U.S. China policy than I think a lot of us in the China field anticipated. Like there's a remarkable amount of continuity. There's basically even saying the word engagement. When I was in Washington, D.C. last year, people called it the E word, which was shocking to me because it seems so self-defeating to me. And so, like, there are some obvious examples, and the webcast, I think, brought up one of them, which was COVID, where it's really self-defeating of us to be nationalistic about these things, right? Like, viruses don't recognize national borders. Certainly, nor does does the vaccine, treat me differently than it would someone in China, right? Like, these are things that make sense where we're all in this together. Climate change is another, right? There are others, obviously, where we have to think about our own interests, right? And that competition can be healthy, right? And it can serve our national interest, and not necessarily, and like, I have a hard time with the idea that our national interest is just that China is less powerful. I don't think that serves a better global order. And I realize that is an opinion that I hold. And you may disagree with me, and I think that's fine. But either way, there are ways in which our focus on competition, I think, is getting in our own way. The one example I'll bring up, and Ambassador Huntsman brought it up a lot, is human-to-human interaction, and also the China initiative. Like, I don't think it serves our interests at all to create a culture of fear around Chinese American or Chinese national scholars who are working in the United States and like trying to bring them in on technicalities. I don't think it serves any of us, right? I don't think it serves us that there's a program called the Fulbright program that sends scholars over to China where we can do research. The Trump administration canceled that program, and it's still not reinstated, right? And I don't know how it serves in any way our national interest to say, like, let's not go be in China and learn about that country. However you feel about competition and China as a threat, that serves nobody. And so I think that there are areas where I think that even sort of like the people who are really sort of hawkish and people who are really sort of dovish can understand that we are defeating ourselves in the way that we're looking at at this relationship in terms of competition.
And I just want to add a few points. I think Dr. Tam was very good point on those competition, but then additionally, I think specifically the area, it would be besides the economy, the trade, the investment, and some area that China really now focus more, if they have not put much effort in before, is the technology sectors. Well, I think the two countries has unique traits, but of course, U.S. has been the leading position for over years. And then China has been learning and then copying and then try to growing themselves, which they are now today, I think, strong and big enough. And then we want to, I think, expand on their technology area. But then this would be, this of course will be one area that you will see a lot of competition. But on the other hand, it would not be completely that, like a separate without no collaboration. There at certain area, there will be, especially with China now still, even though they're trying to develop their own, but then they are still in a learning progress, and then they will at certain levels still need to seek collaboration from others with the U.S. So that's why we see a lot of exchange program that's going on in the past few years, about 10-20 years, that was very successful, and then they've learned a lot of very innovative and frontier technology skills. And then but then moving forward, I don't think they can do this all alone. There will be an area that they have to can collaborate, even if it's not with the US, it has to be some other country. And then we can imagine, for roughly, I think for instance, artificial intelligence involved companies. In the world, there may be more than 4,000. I think maybe half of those are in the US and 1/3 that actually operated in China. So that will be a big area that we, in the next few years or decade, that China will be invest a lot, and then will try to compete with the US. And yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and then I think in China, the top leader, they have already emphasized, and we can read through all the news in the web, and then they try to emphasize the need of the greater technology, and then they want it to be self-sufficiency. And then they have been pulling like billions of dollars of the state capital into this area. So we can see how determined they are, and then how they want to really be a lead. If not happening pretty soon, but then that would be their determination to go to be a lead in this area. And then and another area that that the U.S. China would we would look for independence, it would be the knowledge production. Like the talent and capital has been invested, the exchange of technology, known how these two countries now take place among private business, and then leading technology company in these two countries has been building a lot of research center. Some of those that you may be very familiar, like Alibaba, Baidu, and Transit, are very well known in China. And I think TikTok as well, that leading in this market, even in the US. It's just like the Apple and Microsoft tells us they are now have ability to have their own research center, and then try to develop in a way that's suit in the system of the society.
Having said all of that, in your minds, do you think that the true relationship between the U.S. and China, what is it a good one? Is it spiraling down? Is it what does that look like to you in your minds? And I'm sure different administrations and there's some roller coasters up and down, but what does that look like to you now?
You want me to start or do you?
Yeah.
Okay. So the short answer is I don't think it's great. I think it's really tense. I think that for some people that was an important corrective from earlier periods. But either way, I think that there is a lot of breakdown in communication right now between China and the United States. And this is, I'm an American, so I think a lot about our responsibility here, but it's obviously not just a one-sided kind of thing, right? There's heightened tensions and rhetoric from both China and the United States. As a historian, I sort of like to look at this also in terms of trajectory, and there I see both good news, bad news and good news, and we'll start with the bad news. I think that this relationship is getting worse and has been, arguably since Xi Jinping took power in 2012, but really since the beginning of the Trump administration, where essentially sort of there was a one-upping on both sides of heightened rhetoric between the two. And so I see that relationship getting worse, and that worries me a little bit because, again, we don't live in a vacuum, right? We share the globe, and we have shared interests, they exist. And I think a lot about how in the 1960s, like that was arguably one of the worst times of U.S. China relations, where there were essentially sort of no bilateral talks until Nixon went to China in 1972, right? That said, the good news I see is looking at that period in 1966, is that I think that there is room for warmth. And again, that warmth doesn't have to come in the sense of us like bowing down on our values, especially when it comes to human rights or sort of like free trade or whatever our values might be. I don't think that it has to come at the expense of that. But talking to sort of people who were a part of the sort of foreign like U.S. China relations sphere in the 1960s and 70s. And they seem really calm about this. They're like, yeah, we've been through this before. And things got better, right? Things get worse and then they get better. And so that calm always makes me feel slightly more optimistic. I think that the meeting between Xi and Biden also it's a small step. Ambassador Huntsman said this, we're not going to see this, I think, for years, but the fact that they met, the fact that before they met, Xi Jinping put out a statement saying that there is a shared interest in peace is great news. Like that was great, right? And so I see the possibility that maybe we're not going to keep calling engagement the E word anymore. And so that gives me a little bit of hope. This webcast gives me a little bit of hope that we can get back to a place where, at the very least, we can pursue our own national interests without shooting ourselves in the foot by not being able to communicate with a really important country on the world stage.
And I can see that in a perspective, like, a person that, I used to travel back and forth. I can feel like it would not be a benefit for us. When the relationship was really close for these two countries, like I even though back then I don't have citizenship, and then I hope, but then I have visa for 10 years. I think both country people can apply for visa with 10 years with multiple interests, and then it's very, you're flexible to get into or visit or, and then also for another big market or for revenue generator would be like a big population from China students that come to the US. And then also a US company can use they take advantage of using the cheap labor market in China. So during those time, I think, every US business want to have a business or open another office in China. They want to, make money from there. And then every university in the US want to have a stateless campus in China, and then try to deliver the education. And every Chinese students, a lot of them say, I want to go to the US to go for education. Actually, I'm one of those. Right. So I think when those are quite open, the policies are quite friendly, and then both countries, people take advantage, and then we are all like, it's a win-win thing for both countries, and then the people living in those two countries. And with right now, the current situation that is like, my parents were here in 2019 with a hope that they could go back in 6 months. And then with this whole pandemic, and then it has been locked down for 3 years. So basically they are stuck meaning that it was no flight, and then everything like, you go back and probably you won't get a 10-year visa. And then that would be like a huge not convenience for people like try to visit. And then, of course, in business perspective, and then there's so many restrictions right now from both countries that try to give each other like hard time. I think that makes everything much difficult. And then let alone the supply chain. And when there was a time when we really rely on something from China, or China was rely on something from the other country. Now with this relationship, currently relationship, it makes that I think we start to realize that we have to face a situation that we have to be independent. Because if you just recall when pandemic just started, and the US, we basically out of a mask because we did not try to produce any of those. You rely a lot on the Chinese market. But back then they try to they have a restriction. They don't want to export any of those to here. So and then also like the other high tech that US has been put like restriction to not sell to China, and then they are facing a difficulty time to actually put everything together into a complete product. So I just from perspective of a person that living the society, I see the benefit is less than the disadvantage.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions, although I didn't want to ask about Taiwan, but I also want to bring it up to the audience. So I'm going to ask a question, and then depending on how many questions we're going to have, we might get to that. But talk a little bit about, Dr. Tam, you're talking about grassroots cultural diplomacy, and what does that look like? What is it like growing up? You've been there many times. You lived there, I think. And what does that look like? And what is the role of universities?
I will leave Dr. Sun to talk about what it's like to grow up in China, because while I have lived there, I certainly did not grow up there. But as far as sort of what to me this human to human interaction would look like, and the role of universities is twofold. I can't stress how much study abroad is a critical part of foreign relations. I'm a beneficiary of it. I spent a year in Hong Kong. I'm a beneficiary of the Fulbright program, actually, too, Fulbright and Fulbright Hayes, which let me live for China in 2 years. And there are some things I think that you cannot know without being there, right? And they're also critical to creating empathy, right? We talk a lot about China as a stand-in for its government, and there are real reasons, to me anyway, to be very critical of the government. But it's also a country full of people. They're human beings, and a lot of the people, and almost everybody who's living there is not thinking about U.S. China relations. They're thinking about getting jobs and finding love and spending time with family and these kinds of things. And when you start thinking about China as a country full of people with hugely diverse wants and needs and emotions and goals, then I think that puts a different spin on what engagement looks like. And I think that universities are at the forefront of that. I think we're really critical to that. I also think we're really critical to creating knowledge. There is amazing knowledge that comes out of Chinese universities, in particular in science and technology, that is important to the world of knowledge. I'm a historian, and in that area, there are real limitations to what my colleagues in the PRC can do because of censorship. It's important that we engage our colleagues because they're doing incredible work there, but they have constraints, and U.S. universities are critical to shining a light on things like what's happening in Xinjiang. The entire focus in the administration and the bills that came out of that was primarily the work of scholars who, because they were abroad, could study these things, right? And I'm an academic, knowledge is important. I'm always going to believe that, and universities are critical to making sure that whatever decisions we make in terms of foreign relations are made with knowledge and nuance, because we can very easily fall into essentialist traps, I think, without that.
Dr. Sinner?
Okay, I just want to add a little bit. Well, as a person that I was born there and grew up there and take my education in both like mid-sized country city in Qingdao and also largest city in Shanghai. I lived there for 25 years and then came to the U.S. for to seek the education, and then of course afterwards living and work here for 15 years. So I think I have some unique experience to experience both human rights in the country of China and here. My generation was in the 1980s, and then you might know back then China has the one-child policy, which means that every country that, especially both your parents are working, are workers, that they are actually have a job, then you are only allowed to have one child. But then we would think it's hard to imagine that a government would tell you to do that. But then I think it's also important to understand the like the context why that policy come up with when China just have ended the Cultural Revolution and everything economy was completely almost collapsed. And then also we are facing the growing population that it's barely can feed people to in that country. And then so I think that when it started, but I grow up by it's not normal for everyone. So I thought it's just normal for one child per family, and then I never thought about it until like years and after years I feel like, oh, you have two kids in your family, and then that's because you have twins. Or in a rural country, they try to have another kid, but then you will face like a big fan that you will be charged to have another kid. But then grow up, and then I received education just equally, and then at the school age to take all the education, elementary and middle school and high school, and then college. And then, but then there is a difference that in China, your education is very competitive. Like it would be a way, or the only way, if your family is not rich or does not have a deep relationship in a way, then that would be your only way to be living a decent life in the future. So it's very competitive for the education to be in the college. It's not like here, as long as you want, or after 50 years you working, and then you decided to return back to college, it's very normal. So the resource of education is not that unlimited. I would say it's limited. But I see that, I never have a second think, you're a girl and then you are not allowed to go to school, or you're a woman, you cannot work. And then my perspective is more about it's an ordinary people, which I think 98% of the population in the society are ordinary people. That we experience like it's just normal life, and then there's nothing like really make us to feel like inconvenience, or like you would challenge the government for certain right. But then living here, you do see that there's a different system, and then people get more protected, your property get protected, and everything get protected by law or by a human rights. It is different, but then I think that's rooted back to the system of how the two countries was operation.
All right, questions. I can feel there are a lot of questions coming up. No? Way back, way back there. All right, if you could ask a question, let us know who you are and your question, please.
I guess one question that has been brought up, especially what China used to from years, like you mentioned about, is how they see the United States as a country that is very mixed, mixed in terms of races, in terms of color, people of color, and so on. Whereas it strikes me as China, and maybe this could be a misconception, as being very same. People are very much the same because they're Chinese. I know there are differences, you know, in the West and the Tibetans or the Muslim population, but by and large, the Chinese seem to be, at least from an external perspective, homogeneous. How do they take in, or let's say Dr. Sun, how do you perceive the United States? How does that strike you? And you compare people in China to people in the United States?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get your questions.
The chat. I think it's in the chat. If you look at, I think Samantha typed it out for you.
Do you want to take Dr. Tam until she reads that?
Sure. I mean, I can start, but I think that Dr. Sun will have better things to say. And this is from my limited experience. I was in China for President Obama's election in 2008. So on a bus in Sichuan, and I announced to the entire bus, I'm like, 500 as a new president. And they were like, okay. But I had a lot of conversations with people at that point where that was really surprising, I think, for people in China, because there was this image that I think is driven by global notions of white supremacy, that America is a white nation. And so President Obama, however you feel about his administration, was transformative, I think, in terms of thinking of like the global image of the United States. There is a general sense in China, from my perspective, that the United States is more diverse than China. I think people I talk to in China would agree that they think that they are like homogeneous, even though they, of course, like it is a multiracial country. But you know, the United States is what, 50-60% white, whereas China is about 90% Han Chinese. So there is a real difference there. But that is sort of my general sense of this. For that reason, actually, I think conversations about race and ethnicity are often difficult or foreign in China. As a scholar of race and ethnicity, I get told a lot that this is not an issue that we face in China. So yeah, I'll leave that there, but Dr. Sun, if you want to add in.
Yeah, I think you have very good perception about how people, right? So before I even came here, in our mind, we don't see a lot of diversity or racial diversity. We just see, you know, all white people or American people like in one category, rather than, you know, so many ethnicities. But then indeed that China, the huge, the big population was the Han, we call the Han region. But then there was actually diversity of 56 different ethnicity, but those 55 would consider minority, and then they're like tiny little percentage. Not that here is like when we talk about different ethnicity or racial diversity, is really like a huge percentage on each. But then from general like Chinese people, they don't really identify that in a way of diversity. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question. I knew there was going to be a question on Taiwan.
I'm prepared.
My name is Matt McDaniel. I'm from Industrial Development Corporation. We're a technology company. One of the things we're concerned about is intellectual property. That is not what my question is about. Since Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the People's Liberation Army and the People's Liberation Army Navy have been essentially practicing a blockade of Taiwan. Is the plan for China to take over Taiwan by blockade or by direct invasion? Do you know?
I don't think anybody knows what Xi Jinping. But I mean, I can sort of answer from what I know of people who actually sort of study the national security issue. So for those who are sort of unfamiliar with the situation in Taiwan, Taiwan is an island off the coast of China. It has a long, complicated history that would take us here all night if I went through it. But essentially, right, it is claimed by China as part of its own country, but operates in a way that I think all of us would recognize as an independent nation, that it has its own government, it has its own army, it has its own borders, it has its own passports, and it has its own sense of national identity, right? Taiwanese do not identify as Chinese citizens, overwhelmingly. Like, I think there are more Americans who would want to be like taken over by China than Taiwanese. And so recently there have been sort of heightened tensions. Nancy Pelosi, when she went to Taiwan, sparked a lot of angry rhetoric and missiles flying, or like sort of flying over Taiwan in response to her visit. Because to China, that is a direct threat to what they perceive as their own territorial sovereignty. There's a lot of questions about whether or not China will invade Taiwan. There are, from the best of my knowledge, the sort of military actions that are happening now do not amount to, say, what Russia did on the border of Ukraine a few months before they invaded Ukraine. There doesn't seem to be the kind of military buildup that would be required for an amphibious invasion, which is incredibly difficult, right? And by that, this means invading a country across the ocean, right? Or across the sea, across the strait. Xi Jinping has made increasingly subtle changes in his rhetoric that have, it seemed to be heightened threat towards Taiwan, which is really concerning. That said, I think we will see different kinds of naval buildup that will give us more of an indication that that is what is going to happen. Your question, however, was also about other ways that China could solve the Taiwan problem from its perspective. There are various kinds of sort of digital warfare that are always possible. Some of that is happening now. There is certainly like election influence that happens now. Taiwan just had like what we would consider a midterm election, I guess, right? They have their presidential elections the same years that we do, in 2024 is the next one. But there are sort of like disinformation campaigns, basically, is something that's happening now, but obviously that could get significantly worse. A blockade is another option. My guess is that Xi Jinping is considering all of these, and that a military invasion is a last resort. But my guess is that his administration wants to not have to do any sort of military action towards Taiwan, because while I believe that sort of what they would call reunification, what I would call invasion, is a top priority, I think not having to do it militarily is also a top priority. I hope that answered your question. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Dr. Sun.
No, well, I was just want to add a little thing, a conversation or how Chinese people would perceive this in a way that I had a conversation with Dr. Tam yesterday. I said, what do you do? What country do you study in Asia? She said, I study China and Taiwan and Hong Kong. It's just for me or for people like just come from China, you would think the answer was just like I'm asking you, what country do you study in the North America? You would tell me I study U.S, Texas, and Arizona. So I think deep in our mind, at least the education so many years from China, in our mind, this is a providence. This is just the state of China. Especially, I mean, you didn't ask Hong Kong, but then after, what happens with Hong Kong is now become it's just in everyone's mind that this is just a normal city. It's just no difference than other city in China. That Hong Kong is just a part of it. So I just want to see, no one in China actually wanted, population, ordinary people does not want to have a war. That would be the worst solution, because, and and Dr. Tam made a good point. I think everyone was looking for what's going on with the current war between Russia and Ukraine, because that would be mirror in a way how China going to face if there will be war with with Taiwan. So I think in different perspective, and then this could be I don't even think that might happen. But then from the population in the society, it's not a wish.
All right, thank you so much. If we could give them thank you, applause for joining us. It looks like the sun is not set in Houston yet, according to the background. I know Dr. Tam will be here a little bit, so thank you. And I know both schools have vibrant programs, exchange programs, which we didn't get to talk about too much. Dr. Tam alluded to. I really appreciate you all for coming out. We will have their contacts. If you would like them to follow up with any other questions or comments. Thank you for attending. Thank you to all of our members, to the board, and all the students. I know there's some students here too, so thank you for making time to be here. We appreciate Trinity University. Dr. Tam, thank you for arranging all of this. And there's a lot of food left over, so please help yourselves. Thank you for coming. See you at the annual meeting. Thanks. Bye.